It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Nova first noticed something wasn't right. At 67, she still prided herself on keeping up with her morning walks, tending to her little garden behind the house, and cooking Sunday dinners for her 2 grown children when they visited. But that day, as she stood in her kitchen seasoning a fillet of fish, one she'd always believed was the healthy choice, she felt a sudden, dull ache in her hands. At first, she brushed it off, thinking it was just the weather. Yet later that evening, as she tried to recall the name of a neighbor she'd known for years, her mind came up empty. That gap in her memory, small as it was, left her uneasy in a way she couldn't shake. Over the next few weeks, the little lapses began to pile up, misplacing her reading glasses, forgetting whether she'd taken her morning medication, feeling more tired halfway through her daily walk. Nova told herself it was just part of getting older, something everyone goes through. But deep down, there was a quiet worry she couldn't ignore, an unsettling thought that something in her body was shifting in ways she didn't understand. Her daughter, Elise, noticed too. "You've been forgetting things more often lately, Mom," she said gently one evening. Nova smiled and waved it off, but the word stayed with her. The turning point came one Saturday at the local community center, where Nova had been helping organize a fundraising dinner. She'd been preparing one of her favorite dishes, grilled king mackerel, the same recipe her late husband used to love. Halfway through the evening, as she was chatting with a friend, a sudden wave of dizziness hit her. She steadied herself on the back of a chair, her heart pounding faster than usual. It passed after a few minutes, but she felt shaken. Elise insisted on taking her to the doctor the following week. Nova expected to hear the usual, "Watch your blood pressure, get some rest." But what she heard instead caught her completely off guard. Her doctor, Dr. Lin, reviewed the tests and asked a question Nova wasn't expecting. "How often do you eat fish like king mackerel or tuna?" Nova was taken aback. "A couple of times a week, sometimes more," she replied. "Why?" Dr. Lin explained that some fish, especially certain large or long-lived species, can carry high levels of mercury, a heavy metal that over time can build up in the body. For younger people, the body can often process small amounts without major issues. But for older adults whose kidneys, liver, and immune systems aren't as quick to filter toxins, the risk is much greater. That buildup, he said, could be quietly affecting her memory, her coordination, even her heart. Nova sat in silence, replaying all the meals she'd prepared over the years. She had always thought fish was the safer choice, lean protein, good for the heart, packed with omega-3s. It was the food she turned to when she wanted to eat healthy. The idea that it might be slowly contributing to her symptoms felt like a betrayal. Part of her wanted to dismiss it, to cling to the comfort of her old habits. But another part, stronger, steadier, knew she couldn't ignore what she'd just learned. "So what do I do?" she asked quietly. Dr. Lin smiled kindly. "We'll make a plan. You don't have to give up fish, Nova. You just need to choose the right ones." That night, Nova couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the rain against her bedroom window, thinking about her late husband and the countless dinners they'd shared. She thought about her grandchildren, about wanting to be there for their school plays and birthday parties. She thought about the way her hands had trembled over her coffee cup last week, and the look in Elise's eyes when she mentioned the memory lapses. More than anything, she realized she didn't want her health to quietly slip away because of something she could change. The fear was there, yes, but so was a flicker of determination. Over the next few days, Nova began to pay closer attention to what was in her kitchen. She opened the freezer and saw the familiar packages of fish she'd bought on sale, the ones she'd chosen without thinking twice. She started reading labels, noticing words she'd never paid attention to before: wild caught, imported, farmed. She searched online, learning which fish were safer for older adults and which ones carried higher risks. The more she read, the more she understood that this wasn't about giving up her favorite meals, it was about protecting her future, one choice at a time. When Elise came over the following Sunday, she found her mother at the stove, cooking something new, wild-caught salmon, lightly seasoned with lemon and dill. "I thought you loved king mackerel," Elise said, a little surprised. Nova smiled, flipping the fish in the pan. "I do, but I love my memory, my balance, and my time with you even more." They sat down to eat, and for the first time in weeks, Nova felt a quiet sense of control return. It wasn't about fear anymore, it was about knowing better and doing better. As the weeks turned into months, Nova noticed small changes. She felt steadier on her walks, less foggy in the mornings. The dull ache in her hands had eased, and the dizzy spells hadn't returned. She still had her moments. She was 67 after all, but they no longer filled her with the same worry. She was learning to see each meal as a choice that shaped her days ahead. And in those choices, she found not just better health, but a deeper sense of care for herself. Looking back, she realized that the turning point wasn't the dizziness at the community center or even Dr. Lin's warning. It was the moment she decided to listen, to really listen, to what her body had been trying to tell her. And now, with each careful swap and every mindful meal, Nova was writing a new chapter for herself. One where the food she loved didn't just taste good, but kept her strong enough to enjoy every memory yet to come. It was one of those evenings that felt wrapped in comfort. The rain tapped gently on the kitchen window. The air was warm with the scent of lemon, garlic, and sizzling fish. Nova moved with an easy rhythm, seasoning, flipping, tasting, her hands familiar with every step. Cooking was her language of love, a way she stayed connected to her late husband's memory and to her family's traditions. That night, she was making grilled king mackerel, just as she had countless times before. Elise, her daughter, was coming over for dinner, and nothing made Nova happier than setting the table for someone she loved. They sat across from each other, the plates steaming, the sound of rain blending with the soft hum of the old kitchen clock. The first bite brought that familiar richness, slightly oily, deeply savory, kissed with citrus. "You've still got it, Mom," Elise said with a smile, and Nova laughed, feeling that old, quiet pride. But as they talked, Nova noticed something small, almost nothing at all. She struggled to remember the name of the neighbor who'd just moved in next door, someone she had met just last week. She laughed it off, making a joke about her Swiss cheese memory, but Elise tilted her head, the way she did when she was worried. After dinner, Nova cleared the table and washed the dishes, but the moment lingered. She'd been forgetting little things lately, shopping list items, where she'd put her keys, the ending of a movie she'd seen twice. She told herself it was normal. Everyone her age forgot things, but as she stood there, drying her hands, she remembered the slight tremor in her fingers earlier in the day, the one she thought was from too much coffee. She didn't mention it to Elise. It was probably nothing. Still, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was different. The next morning, she woke up to a heavy gray sky and an odd sluggishness in her body. Her morning walk felt harder than usual, her legs less steady. She reached for her coffee, but her hand trembled just enough for her to notice. She sat in her favorite chair, pulling the knitted blanket over her lap, and stared out at the rain-slicked street. She thought about her husband, how he used to say that aging was just a little rust in the joints. But this felt different. This felt like something quietly slipping in, unseen. That Saturday at the community center fundraiser, she prepared her beloved king mackerel recipe again. The kitchen bustled with volunteers, the air filled with chatter and the clatter of serving trays. Nova was in her element until it happened. A sudden wave of dizziness, the kind that makes the floor feel unsteady, rushed over her. She gripped the counter, closing her eyes for a moment. A volunteer asked if she was all right. "Just stood up too fast," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The dizziness faded, but so did her confidence. Elise noticed the change. That evening, over cups of chamomile tea, she reached across the table. "Mom, I think you should see Dr. Lin, just to be sure." Nova started to protest, but something in Elise's voice, a blend of worry and firmness, made her stop. The following week, she sat in Dr. Lin's office, the smell of antiseptic and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights surrounding her. He reviewed her test results, then asked an unexpected question. "How often do you eat fish like king mackerel or tuna?" She frowned. "A couple of times a week, sometimes more. Why?" Dr. Lin explained that certain fish, especially larger species, carry high levels of mercury. For younger people, the body can usually flush out small amounts, but for someone her age, mercury can build up silently, affecting memory, coordination, and even heart health. "I'm not saying it's the only cause," he said gently, "but it could be a piece of the puzzle." Nova left the clinic with a strange mix of emotions. Part of her felt relieved that there might be an explanation, something tangible, but another part felt betrayed. How could something she'd always believed was healthy be quietly working against her? At home, she opened the freezer and stared at the neatly wrapped fillets of king mackerel. She thought about tossing them right then and there, but instead she closed the door. She wasn't ready to let go of the familiar, not yet. That night, she lay in bed, the doctor's words echoing in her mind. She thought about the little moments she'd taken for granted, the ease of walking without worrying about her balance, the sharpness of recalling a neighbor's name, the steady hand that had never trembled over a coffee cup. She thought about her grandchildren's faces and how much she wanted to be present for every laugh, every hug. Somewhere between those thoughts, a quiet resolve began to form. She didn't know exactly what changes she would make yet, but she knew she had to start. In the days that followed, she began to notice things she'd overlooked before. At the grocery store, she saw wild-caught labels she'd ignored for years. She noticed how some fish were from faraway places she'd never heard of, and others came from nearby waters. She found herself hesitating at the seafood counter, thinking about the stories Dr. Lin had told her of patients who'd felt sharper and steadier after changing what they ate. She began to wonder if she could be one of those stories. When Elise visited the next Sunday, Nova cooked something different. Wild-caught salmon, baked with dill and lemon. Elise raised an eyebrow as she set the plate down. "No mackerel?" she teased. Nova smiled. "Just trying something new." The salmon tasted lighter, fresher, and somehow the meal felt like more than just dinner. It felt like a small but certain step towards something better. In that moment, Nova realized that change didn't have to come all at once. It could be as simple as one meal, one choice, one conversation at a time. The cozy dinner that had hidden a silent threat was now the memory that pushed her to pay attention. And while she still had a freezer to clear and habits to rethink, she no longer felt powerless. She felt awake. The following week, Nova found herself sitting by the window in her small, sunlit living room, a cup of warm green tea cradled in her hands. She had been thinking a lot about what Dr. Lin had said, turning his words over like pebbles in her mind. As we get older, the body doesn't filter out toxins the way it used to. It seemed like such a simple sentence, but the weight of it settled deep in her chest. She had never considered how much her body had been quietly working for her all these years, filtering, repairing, defending, without her even noticing. That afternoon, Elise dropped by with a basket of fresh vegetables from the farmer's market. They sat together at the kitchen table, sorting through the produce, when Nova finally spoke. "Do you remember when you were little and you could eat ice cream right before bed without a single bad dream?" Elise laughed. "Sure, I could eat anything back then and still sleep like a rock." Nova nodded slowly. "Our bodies are like that when we're young, strong, fast, forgiving. But as we get older, the liver, the kidneys, they slow down. They don't sweep out the bad stuff as easily, so things stay longer." Her voice caught slightly, not from fear, but from the realization of just how much she had taken her body's resilience for granted. She remembered Dr. Lin explaining it in the simplest way possible. Imagine your body as a home with two hardworking cleaners, one for the kitchen, one for the living room. When they're young, they sweep fast, scrub every corner, toss the trash without missing a spot. But over the decades, their brooms wear down, their arms tire, and some trash starts to pile up in the corners. That trash in her case was mercury, tiny amounts that had slipped in through her favorite meals over many years. "It doesn't seem like much at first," Dr. Lin had said, "but little by little it adds up." For Nova, that adding up had been almost invisible. A few extra moments to recall a word, a heavier step on her walks, more afternoons where she needed to sit down earlier than she used to. She had always blamed the weather, her age, or just being tired from errands. But now, with each memory lapse or ache, she wondered if those were little whispers from her body trying to warn her. That evening, while preparing dinner, she decided to test something. Instead of reaching for the mackerel in the freezer, she opened the pantry and found a can of light tuna, one Dr. Lin had said was lower in mercury. She made a simple tuna salad with fresh herbs from her garden and served it with slices of whole grain bread. It wasn't as rich or indulgent as her grilled fish, but it felt clean somehow. Lighter. As she ate, she thought about what Elise had said earlier in the day. "It's not just about living longer, Mom. It's about feeling good while you're living." The next morning, Nova felt a little steadier on her walk. She told herself it might just be the cool air or the joy of seeing the camellias bloom along the neighbor's fence. But deep down, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, these small swaps could make a real difference. Later that week, she invited her friend Margaret over for tea. Margaret had been her walking partner for years, and if anyone would notice changes, it was her. Over steaming cups, Nova shared what she'd learned from Dr. Lin. Margaret listened quietly, then leaned back in her chair. I've been feeling more tired lately too. Maybe it's not just age, maybe it's what we're putting in our bodies. They sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, both women realizing they'd never questioned the very foods they'd been told were healthy. That conversation stayed with Nova long after Margaret left. It reminded her that the changes she was making weren't just for herself. They could ripple outward, touching the lives of the people she cared about. And as she rinsed the teacups and placed them on the rack to dry, she felt something she hadn't felt in a while. She was not just reacting to her health, she was actively shaping it. That night, before bed, she stood at the mirror brushing her hair, the soft lamplight casting gentle shadows across her face. There were lines there, yes, and silver strands she no longer tried to hide, but there was also a new steadiness in her eyes. She thought again of Dr. Lin's words, and for the first time, they didn't feel like a warning. They felt like a map, one she was finally ready to follow. It was a breezy Sunday morning when Nova decided to clear out her freezer. The bright sunlight spilled across her kitchen table, glinting off the stainless steel kettle as it whistled softly. She had been avoiding this moment, but now it felt necessary, like turning a page in a book she'd been stuck on for too long. One by one, she pulled out the frozen parcels, the label smudged from condensation. And there it was, near the back, wrapped neatly in butcher paper, the last fillet of king mackerel. She held it in her hands longer than she meant to. There was nothing special about the package itself, but memories came rushing back. Dinners with her husband, quiet evenings with Elise, even that community fundraiser where she'd felt the first dizzy wave. In those memories, she saw herself laughing, chatting, and moving about the kitchen with ease. But now, layered on top of those scenes, was the knowledge of what Dr. Lin had told her. High in mercury, slow to leave the body, dangerous for your memory. She realized this fish wasn't just food. It was a thread woven through her recent lapses, tremors, and fatigue. The memory that stung the most was from just 2 months earlier. She'd been reading a bedtime story to her grandson, Liam, a simple one they'd read together many times before. But halfway through, she blanked on the next word. It wasn't a tricky word or a foreign name, it was river. She stumbled, smiled, and made something up so Liam wouldn't notice, but inside she felt the sharp pinch of panic. It was only a second, but it left her uneasy for days. At the time, she had blamed it on stress, maybe not enough sleep. But sitting there with the mackerel in her hands, she wondered if that little moment had been another quiet nudge from her body, telling her it was time to pay attention. She'd read somewhere that mercury doesn't just cloud memory, it slows the brain's ability to connect the dots, like a fog settling between thoughts. She could feel that fog in her own life now, sometimes subtle, sometimes heavier. She set the fish down on the counter and made herself a promise. No more king mackerel, not in her house, not on her plate, not even at a friend's dinner party. The decision felt both heavy and strangely freeing. Heavy because it was a goodbye to something familiar, freeing because it meant she was choosing her mind, her sharpness, her ability to tell stories to her grandchildren, to recall the details of her garden, to remember the names of neighbors, over the fleeting pleasure of a rich, oily filly. Later that week, she went grocery shopping with a new sense of purpose. She lingered at the seafood counter, scanning the labels for wild caught, looking for options she'd read about, salmon, sardines, trout. She asked the clerk where the fish had come from, something she'd never done before. He seemed surprised by her questions, but answered kindly. For the first time in years, she walked out of the store with no mackerel, no just this once exceptions. When Elise came over for lunch a few days later, Nova served grilled sardines with a side of fresh salad. Sardines? Elise asked, lifting an eyebrow. Aren't those the ones you used to say were too strong tasting? Nova smiled. Maybe I just never gave them a fair chance. The sardines were tender, flavorful, and satisfying in a way she hadn't expected. More importantly, she felt good eating them, not just physically, but emotionally, knowing they were low in mercury and high in nutrients her body could use. In the evenings, she noticed a subtle shift. Her mind felt a little clearer, as though some of that fog had lifted. She still forgot the occasional thing, where she'd put her reading glasses or whether she'd watered the basil, but the lapses felt less frequent. She started to trust her own mind again, and that trust made her want to keep going, to keep making choices that protected it. One night, as she sat with a notebook in hand, jotting down ideas for meals, she caught herself smiling. The change wasn't just about removing one fish from her diet, it was about reclaiming something she feared she was losing. The first fish that had stolen pieces of her sharp memory was now out of her life, and in its place was the quiet confidence of knowing she was steering her own course. The mackerel in the freezer never made it to her plate. The next morning, she wrapped it tighter, walked it to the trash bin, and closed the lid without looking back. Nova had read plenty of articles over the years that praised fish for its heart and brain benefits, but now, sitting in her armchair with the soft afternoon light falling across the pages of a health magazine, she saw the other side of the story laid bare. The headline read, "High mercury fish older adults should avoid." At the top of the list, king mackerel. It wasn't just high in mercury, the article explained, it was one of the worst offenders, ranking above many other species in contamination levels. She traced the printed letters with her fingertip, almost as if feeling the words might make them more real. "Doctor." Lynn's voice came back to her, calm but firm. King mackerel isn't dangerous because of bacteria or poor handling. It's dangerous because of what it accumulates in its flesh over time, methylmercury. The bigger and older the fish, the more it builds up. He had compared it to a sponge, soaking in toxins from the smaller fish it ate, year after year. And the trouble with methylmercury, he'd continued, is that it's not easy for the body to get rid of, especially when the body's natural filtration slows down with age. The analogy stuck with her. She thought of her own freezer, the neat parcels of fish she used to buy without hesitation, never imagining they might be carrying something her body couldn't shake off. She remembered reading that methylmercury doesn't just sit in the bloodstream, it crosses into the brain, affecting nerve cells, memory, coordination. In her mind's eye, she pictured it like a slow drip of ink spreading across a clean sheet of paper, the lines blurring just enough to make the words harder to read. That night, as she prepared dinner, she found herself pausing at the counter, knife in hand, thinking about all the years she'd served king mackerel, believing it was one of the best choices she could make. Her husband had loved it grilled over charcoal with a squeeze of fresh lime. She had loved the way it seemed to fuel her energy for days afterward. Now she wondered if that energy had been chipped away over time, traded for subtle, creeping effects she hadn't recognized until recently. 2 days later, she brought up the subject with Elise over tea. "Do you remember the fundraiser last year? The one where I made the grilled mackerel?" Elise nodded, smiling. Of course, everyone loved it. Nova took a slow sip from her mug before continuing. "That fish might have been hurting me all along." Elise's brows knit together. "What do you mean?" Nova explained what Dr. Lynn had told her about mercury and how king mackerel ranked near the top for danger. Elise's face softened into concern. "I guess we just never thought to question it. We were told fish was good for us and we believed it." The following weekend, Nova visited the local fish market. She had a small notepad in her purse where she'd written down safer alternatives: wild-caught salmon, sardines, rainbow trout. When the fishmonger greeted her, she didn't shy away from asking questions. Where was it caught? Was it wild or farmed? How fresh was it? She noticed how different it felt to shop this way, how each question gave her a little more control. She walked away with 2 fillets of salmon and a tin of sardines, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Back at home, she marinated the salmon with olive oil, lemon, and fresh dill from her garden. As the fish baked, the aroma filled her kitchen, warm and clean. The first bite was tender, full of flavor, and free from the lingering worry that had shadowed her meals for so long. Elise joined her for dinner and, after the first mouthful, grinned. "You might have found your new specialty." Nova smiled, thinking of all the dinners still ahead of them, dinners that wouldn't come with a hidden cost. In the weeks that followed, Nova found herself sharing what she'd learned with friends. At the community center, she gently mentioned to Margaret that king mackerel might not be the best choice anymore. She didn't lecture or make it sound like a rule, she simply told her story, how she'd discovered the mercury connection, how she'd noticed subtle improvements since switching to safer fish. Margaret listened intently, then promised to look into it herself. For Nova, it was never about fear-mongering or dramatic gestures. It was about small, deliberate changes, choosing what would protect her health rather than quietly chip away at it. The king mackerel, once a fixture in her kitchen, had become a clear reminder of how easy it is to trust something without knowing its full story. Now she wanted every bite to be a conscious choice, one that carried her forward instead of holding her back. And as she washed the last dinner plate one evening, the warm water running over her hands, she felt a quiet gratitude for that moment in Dr. Lynn's office. It had been a turning point disguised as a conversation, a chance to see the hidden trap for what it was, and to step away from it before it could take more than it already had. It was Elise's birthday, and she had insisted on taking her mother out to a little seaside restaurant she'd recently discovered. The place was small but elegant, the kind where soft candlelight dances against polished wood, and the menu feels like a carefully curated letter from the chef. Nova, dressed in her favorite navy dress and a light cardigan, happy for the chance to spend an evening with her daughter without worrying about cooking or cleaning up afterward. When the waiter arrived with the menus, Nova scanned the list. She noticed that most of the dishes were described with poetic touches: flaky white fish with lemon beurre blanc, chef's catch of the day, seared fillet with herbed butter. None of them specified the exact type of fish. A year ago, she wouldn't have thought twice. Tonight, she hesitated. The words of Dr. Lin came back to her. Always ask what kind of fish it is, especially if they just call it whitefish or catch of the day. The waiter returned to take their order. Elise asked about the chef's special, and the waiter smiled. "It's one of my favorites. Tender, mild, melts in your mouth." Something in Nova's chest tightened. "And what kind of fish is it exactly?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. "Tilefish," he replied. Elise glanced at her mother, sensing the shift. Nova thanked the waiter and closed the menu gently. "I think I'll try the cod tonight instead," she said with a small smile. Once the waiter walked away, Elise leaned in. "Is tilefish bad?" Nova nodded. "It's one of the highest in Mercury, worse than the mackerel I used to eat. Dr. Lin told me to stay far away from it." Elise's eyes widened. "I'm glad you asked. I never would have thought to." Nova smiled faintly, but inside she felt a quiet relief, like she'd just sidestepped a trap she hadn't seen before. She started paying attention. Over dinner, they talked about small things: the weather, Elise's work, the new plants in Nova's garden. But in the back of Nova's mind, she kept thinking about how easily tilefish had slipped into the menu without warning. She thought about the friends she knew who loved trying new restaurants, how often they probably ordered white fish without knowing what it really was. She made a mental note to share the story the next time she saw them. 2 weeks later, that chance came. Nova was at the community center helping set up for the monthly luncheon. Margaret was in charge of ordering the catering, and she proudly showed Nova the menu: grilled catch of the day with vegetables. "Sounds nice, doesn't it?" Margaret said. Nova nodded but asked, "Did they say what kind of fish it is?" Margaret shook her head. "I just assumed it would be something good." Nova gently told her about tilefish, explaining what she'd learned and how easily it could appear in dishes without people realizing. Margaret's eyes narrowed in concern. "I'm going to call them right now," she said, pulling out her phone. When the caterer confirmed it was tilefish, Margaret switched the order to haddock instead. She turned to Nova afterward, shaking her head. "You might have just saved a lot of us from something we didn't need in our bodies." The gratitude in her voice warmed Nova's heart. That evening, Nova reflected on how her awareness was growing, not just in grocery stores, but in every situation where food crossed her path. It wasn't about fear, it was about knowledge. Knowing the names behind vague menu labels, knowing when to ask questions, knowing when to choose something else. These small acts felt like threads she was weaving into a safety net for herself and the people she cared about. The cod she'd ordered at Elise's birthday dinner had been delicious, light, flaky, satisfying. And afterward, she'd walked along the shore with her daughter, the cool wind lifting the edges of her cardigan, feeling lighter than she had in months. That simple choice had carried no shadow of worry, no hidden cost. It was just a meal, enjoyed fully in the moment, and that, she thought, was exactly how it should be. The first time Nova truly felt the weight of what Mercury could do to a mind was not in Dr. Lin's office, but at her own kitchen table on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. She had been working on a crossword puzzle, something she'd done for decades without trouble. It was her way of keeping her mind sharp, her little morning ritual with coffee and sunlight. But that day, she found herself staring at a clue for nearly 5 minutes, knowing the answer was there somewhere, like a word perched just out of reach. It wasn't until she gave up and checked the back page for the solution that she saw it: orchid, a flower she grew herself in a pot by the window. The realization sat heavy. This wasn't just forgetting where she put her keys or leaving laundry in the machine too long. This was her brain, once quick and nimble, tripping over something familiar. And in that quiet moment, she couldn't help but wonder if this was what Dr. Lin had meant that Mercury didn't just steal memory in big, obvious pieces, but in small, almost imperceptible slips, the kind that chip away at your confidence before you even realize what's happening. Later that week, she asked Dr. Lin to explain it again in a way she could hold on to. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Think of your brain as a network of roads," he said. "Messages are cars traveling along those roads, delivering information, memories, words, balance, emotions. Mercury is like debris that clogs certain intersections. It doesn't always stop the traffic entirely, but it slows it down, sometimes redirects it the wrong way. Over time, if the debris keeps piling up, the traffic becomes sluggish and unreliable." Nova thought of her crossword puzzle, of Liam's bedtime story when River had slipped away, of the moment at the community fundraiser when her balance wavered. They were small things, but each felt like a car delayed at an intersection in her mind. And the thought of those delays growing more frequent was enough to strengthen her resolve. She began to pay closer attention to how her body and mind felt after meals. If she ate something lighter, wild salmon, grilled vegetables, fresh fruit, she noticed her afternoons were clearer, less foggy. On the rare days when she had fish at a friend's house and forgot to ask what kind it was, she sometimes felt a heaviness in her thoughts by evening, like the air in her mind had grown a little thicker. She didn't know if it was the mercury or simply coincidence, but she didn't want to take chances anymore. One Sunday afternoon, Elise came over with a bundle of fresh herbs and a loaf of crusty bread. As they cooked together, Nova told her about Dr. Lin's road and traffic analogy. Elise listened intently, her brow furrowed. "It's scary to think about, Mom. I guess I never realized that food could affect memory like that." Nova smiled gently. "Neither did I. But now that I do, I'm going to do everything I can to keep those roads clear." That night, after Elise left, Nova sat by her kitchen window with a small plate of sliced apples and cheese. She thought about how easy it had been all those years to believe that a healthy diet was just about calories or cholesterol. No one had told her that the food she loved could carry invisible elements that worked against her brain's delicate wiring. But now that she knew, she felt a quiet responsibility, not just to herself, but to her daughter, her grandchildren, and even her friends. The brain, she realized, wasn't just another organ. It was where her stories lived, where her husband's voice still lingered, where Liam's laughter echoed, where the memory of her first home, her first garden, and her first gray hair all resided. Protecting it meant protecting the threads of her life itself. And for that, she thought, there was no choice too small, no meal too trivial to overlook. It was late summer when Nova received an invitation to her old friend Clara's anniversary dinner. Clara and her husband were celebrating 40 years together, and the event was being held at a well-known coastal restaurant. The kind of place with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the water, where the menu was handwritten each day based on the freshest catch. Nova was looking forward to it, not just the meal, but the chance to reconnect with people she hadn't seen in years. That evening, dressed in a soft cream blouse and her favorite pearl earrings, she felt a little spark of excitement as she arrived. The dining room was warm with golden light, the hum of conversation, and the faint scent of the ocean carried in on the breeze from the open balcony doors. She found her seat beside Clara, who was glowing with happiness. When the waiter came around, Nova scanned the menu. Her eyes landed on a dish she hadn't had in years, grilled swordfish steak, served with a rosemary-infused butter sauce. It looked indulgent, special, the sort of thing you order when you want to mark an occasion. The little voice in her head reminded her of Dr. Lin's words, but she hesitated. It's just one night, she thought, a treat for a celebration. She ordered it, telling herself that balance was about flexibility. When the plate arrived, the swordfish was thick and perfectly seared, the aroma rich and inviting. The first bite was everything she remembered, dense, meaty, with a buttery depth that seemed to melt across her tongue. She savored every mouthful, enjoying the easy laughter at the table, the clink of glasses, the warm glow of shared memories. For a while, she forgot all about mercury levels and brain traffic jams. It wasn't until the next morning that she felt the difference. She woke with a heaviness behind her eyes and a strange fatigue in her limbs, as if she'd walked a mile uphill in her sleep. Her thoughts felt slower, like they were moving through molasses. She forgot to add sugar to her tea, something she never did, and she had to check the clock twice to remember what time her dentist appointment was. They weren't dramatic symptoms, nothing that would make someone rush to the doctor, but to Nova, they felt like a shadow she recognized all too well. That afternoon, she called Elise to chat. I don't know if it's just in my head, she said, but I feel off today, sluggish, fuzzy. Elise asked what she'd eaten the night before. When Nova admitted to ordering swordfish, Elise was quiet for a moment. Mom, you told me yourself that was one of the worst for Mercury, Nova sighed. I know, I thought one time wouldn't matter, but maybe for me it does. It was a humbling realization. She had wanted to believe that a special treat was harmless, that her body could shrug it off, but the truth was, she wasn't the same as she'd been at 40 or even 50. The resilience she once relied on was softer now, and even small choices could ripple through her days in ways she didn't expect. That week, she made a promise to herself. Special occasion or not, she would no longer trade her clarity and steadiness for a fleeting taste, no matter how tempting. She thought about all the other ways she could celebrate, with a safer fish, a favorite dessert, a walk along the beach after dinner. She realized that the real treat wasn't the richness of the food, but the freedom to wake up the next morning feeling strong, sharp, and ready for the day. And so, when the next invitation came, a retirement party for a neighbor, Nova scanned the menu with new eyes. She bypassed the swordfish and ordered trout instead, savoring it without a single twinge of worry. The joy of the evening lasted all the way into the next morning, clear and uninterrupted. That, she decided, was the kind of indulgence worth keeping. A few weeks after the anniversary dinner, Nova was flipping through a glossy travel magazine she'd picked up from the library. One page in particular caught her attention. A spread of a cruise ship dining room, silver dome platters being lifted to reveal elegant swordfish steaks plated with vibrant vegetables. The caption read, "A fine dining classic, celebrated for its bold flavor and meaty texture." She stared at it longer than she meant to, the image pulling her back to that rich, buttery bite from Clara's celebration. It was amazing how something so beautiful could hide so much risk. Dr. Lin's words echoed again in her mind. Swordfish is one of the longest living predatory fish. Every year it's alive, it's accumulating mercury from the smaller fish it eats. By the time it's on your plate, it can be one of the most contaminated choices in the ocean. He'd told her that for older adults, swordfish was especially dangerous, not just because of the mercury, but because once it enters the bloodstream, it doesn't simply wash out. It stays, settling into tissues, crossing into the brain, sometimes lingering for months or even years. She remembered asking, "But if you cook it really well, doesn't that get rid of the mercury?" Dr. Lin had shaken his head gently. No amount of heat or seasoning will remove it. Mercury is part of the fish's flesh, not something sitting on the surface. It was a truth that left no room for compromise. Swordfish wasn't just a once-in-a-while risk for someone her age. It was a no-go. That weekend, Nova met Margaret for coffee at their usual cafe. They settled into the corner booth, steam rising from their cups, and Nova told her about the magazine photo. "It's strange," she admitted. I used to think of swordfish as this special, fancy thing. Now it feels like the most expensive mistake on the menu." Margaret chuckled softly. "I know what you mean. My sister had it on a cruise last year. She felt off for days afterward. We thought it was seasickness, but now I wonder." They talked for a long time about how much of their generation had grown up believing certain foods were the height of health or sophistication. Fish was brain food, red meat was strength, margarine was modern. And yet, here they were, unlearning pieces of that old script, discovering that not all fish were created equal. A week later, Nova was at the grocery store when she overheard a couple at the seafood counter debating what to buy for a dinner party. "Swordfish steaks look impressive," the man said. "They're expensive, so they must be good for you." The woman hesitated, looking at the price tag. Nova smiled politely and without lecturing said, "You might want to look up mercury levels in swordfish before you decide. There are some delicious options that are safer." The woman thanked her, curiosity sparking in her eyes, and they walked away with trout instead. That small exchange stayed with Nova. She realized that avoiding swordfish wasn't just about her own health anymore. It was about gently passing along what she'd learned, giving others a chance to make informed choices before the luxury on their plate cost them more than they expected. That night, she cooked herself a dinner of baked trout with lemon and thyme, pairing it with roasted vegetables. It was a simple meal, no silver domes, no candlelit dining room, but it left her feeling light, satisfied, and sharp. She thought about how much she valued waking up the next day with her balance steady, her mind clear, her energy intact. That, she decided, was worth more than any luxury a menu could offer. It was a Friday evening when Elise suggested they try a new Japanese restaurant that had opened downtown. "You'll love it, Mom," she said. "They do the freshest sushi." Nova hesitated for a moment. Sushi had always felt like a treat, fresh, light, colorful, but she also knew that some of the fish used could be trouble for someone her age. Still, she agreed, thinking she could always choose something cooked. The restaurant was warm and inviting, with low lighting, bamboo accents, and the gentle sound of water trickling from a small indoor fountain. As they were seated at the sushi bar, Nova watched the chef's skilled hands slice and shape each piece, the deep reds and soft pinks of the fish glistening under the light. The menu was full of tempting options, and one in particular caught her eye. Bigeye tuna sashimi. The photograph beside it was almost mesmerizing, thick slices of ruby red fish, smooth and perfect. Elise pointed to it. "That one's amazing. Want to share?" Nova felt that small inner pause again. She remembered Dr. Lin telling her, "Bigeye tuna is high on the Mercury list, and when you eat it raw, you also take on the risk of bacteria and parasites that older immune systems have a harder time fighting." She thought about the fatigue she'd felt after the swordfish dinner and the cloudy head that had lingered for days. "I think I'll pass on that one," Nova said gently. "I'll try the cooked salmon roll instead." Elise looked a little surprised, but nodded, ordering the tuna for herself. As they ate, Nova's plate was full of warm, satisfying bites. Grilled eel, salmon rolls, cucumber maki. Elise's tuna was beautiful, but as Nova watched her take each bite, she couldn't help thinking about what was hiding behind that freshness. A week later, Elise called to say she'd been feeling off since that night. "Nothing terrible," she said, "just a little stomach trouble and fatigue." Nova didn't say, "I told you so." Instead, she listened, then shared what she'd learned about raw tuna. "It's not just the mercury," she explained. "It's that your body, even in your 30s, has to fight harder against bacteria or parasites when it's raw. And for me, it's an even bigger gamble." That conversation stuck with Elise, and the next time they went out for Japanese food, she chose a cooked option too. Nova noticed the shift and felt a quiet sense of connection, like her choices were starting to ripple outward. At home one afternoon, Nova found herself craving tuna. Instead of heading to a restaurant, she opened a can of light tuna from her pantry, the lower mercury kind Dr. Lin had recommended. She made a simple salad with olive oil, lemon, celery, and parsley, and ate it on toast. It was satisfying without the worry, a reminder that she didn't have to give up the flavors she loved, just find safer ways to enjoy them. She thought about how easy it had been to overlook these hidden risks in the past. Sushi bars, fancy restaurants, even casual menus often frame tuna as a premium choice. Fresh, clean, full of health benefits. But for her, that favorite had quietly shifted into the category of foods she approached with caution, no matter how beautiful it looked on the plate. The next time she passed by the Japanese restaurant, she smiled, remembering the glow of the lights and the skill of the chef's hands. She knew she'd go back one day, but when she did, she'd order something that let her leave with her mind clear, her body steady, and her health intact. And to her, that was the true definition of fresh. The next time Nova saw Dr. Lin, she decided to bring up the sushi night with Elise. They sat across from each other in his small office, the faint scent of herbal tea drifting in from the staff kitchen. "I stayed away from the bigeye tuna," she told him, but Elise had it. She felt a bit off afterward, and it made me wonder, why does raw tuna seem to hit people like me so much harder? Dr. Lin leaned back slightly, his hands folded. "It's a combination of two things," he began. "First, the mercury levels. Bigeye and albacore tuna are high on the list, and mercury builds up in the body over time. But the second part is what happens when you eat it raw, bacteria and parasites that may not be killed unless the fish has been frozen to exact standards. A younger immune system can often fight off mild contamination without much trouble, but for seniors, the immune response is slower and sometimes weaker, meaning the same exposure can cause a more noticeable, longer-lasting impact." Nova listened, thinking about the mild stomach trouble Elise had faced and how much worse that could be for someone her age. She remembered the days after her swordfish dinner, how it wasn't just fatigue, but a kind of mental fog, an invisible weight she carried around. "So even if it's the same fish," she said slowly, "the risk isn't the same for everyone." Dr. Lin nodded. "Exactly. What feels like a small bump for a younger person can be a much bigger setback for you." Later that week, Nova shared this with Margaret over tea. Margaret frowned. I always thought sushi was clean and safe if the restaurant was good. Nova smiled gently. So did I, but even the best handling can't change what the fish has inside it. She explained about the mercury, about the bacteria that can linger even when the fish looks perfect. Margaret stirred her tea slowly, then said, maybe it's time I skip the sashimi. That night, Nova reflected on how much her thinking had shifted. In the past, she'd seen food choices as mostly about taste and calories. Now each decision felt like a vote for or against her future self, her energy, her memory, her ability to stay independent. She wasn't avoiding certain foods out of fear, but out of respect for the body that had carried her through 67 years. A few days later, Elise invited her for lunch at a small cafe. The menu included a seared tuna salad, the tuna just barely cooked on the outside. Want to share it? Elise asked. Nova shook her head with a smile. I'll stick with the grilled chicken today. I've learned my lesson. Elise didn't argue. She ordered the chicken too. As they ate, Nova felt a quiet pride. This was more than a personal choice. It was a ripple effect, gently influencing the people she loved. Back at home, she opened her pantry and looked at the cans of light tuna she'd stocked up on. They felt like little promises to herself. Same flavor, far less risk. She made a quick tuna and cucumber salad, and as she ate, she thought about the long walk she still wanted to take, the puzzles she still wanted to solve, the stories she still wanted to remember in perfect detail. Every safe choice was another step toward keeping those things within reach. The realization settled over her like a warm blanket. It wasn't about giving up the food she loved, it was about finding ways to enjoy them without quietly letting them take something from her in return. And when it came to raw tuna, she knew the trade-off simply wasn't worth it anymore. On a bright Saturday morning, Nova walked through the automatic doors of her neighborhood supermarket, pushing a cart that wobbled slightly on one wheel. The seafood section was her first stop, as it had been for years. The display gleamed under bright lights, rows of pink fillets laid neatly on crushed ice, each one looking fresh and inviting. There, in the center, was the salmon section. Bold yellow tags shouted "Sale" in cheerful letters. For a moment, she almost reached out for the biggest, prettiest fillet. But something made her pause. The label read, Atlantic salmon, farm-raised, product of Chile. She remembered Dr. Lin telling her, not all salmon is created equal. Farmed salmon, especially from countries with loose regulations, can be loaded with more than just omega-3s. She could still hear the caution in his voice as he explained about overcrowded pens, disease control chemicals, and feed pellets made from low-grade ingredients. Nova thought back to the farm tour she'd once seen on television years ago, how she had admired the idea of sustainable fish farming. Now she knew the other side of the story. Those fish often lived in cramped spaces where parasites thrived, and to keep them alive, farmers relied on antibiotics. Sometimes, chemical colorants were added to the feed just to make the flesh look pink instead of gray. It was a different reality than the wild salmon swimming in cold, clean waters. She pushed her cart a little closer to the display and looked for another option. There it was, tucked off to the side, smaller fillets labeled wild-caught Alaskan salmon. The price was higher, but the label felt like a quiet assurance. She picked one up, feeling its firm texture through the wrapping, and placed it in her cart. The decision gave her a small but satisfying sense of control. At home that afternoon, she cooked the wild salmon simply, just olive oil, lemon, and a sprinkle of fresh dill from her garden. The taste was richer, cleaner, almost like the difference between drinking water from a mountain spring and water that had been sitting too long in a tank. Elise stopped by and took a bite. This tastes different, she said. Nova smiled. That's because it's the real thing. Over dinner, she told Elise about what she'd learned, about the chemicals, the feed, the difference in nutrient levels. Elise listened, wide-eyed, and admitted she'd never thought much about the source of her fish before. It's just salmon, she said. I thought it was all the same. Nova shook her head. That's what I used to think too. The next week, Margaret mentioned she'd bought a big batch of salmon on sale. Nova asked where it was from, and when Margaret said Chile, Nova gently shared what she knew. Margaret's expression shifted from surprise to concern. Maybe I'll use it for just one meal and give the rest away, she said. And next time, I'll look for Alaskan. For Nova, the lesson was clear. Sometimes the most dangerous foods weren't the rare or exotic ones. Sometimes they were the everyday staples, the ones people bought without question, assuming they were safe. She thought about all the families who might be eating farmed salmon regularly, not knowing what else came along with it. That evening, as she sat by the window with a cup of chamomile tea, she felt a quiet satisfaction. She hadn't just made a safer choice for herself, she'd planted small seeds of awareness in others too. And in her mind, that was how change began. One label read, one question asked, one conversation shared at a time. The turning point in how Nova thought about fish came one rainy afternoon when she stumbled across a documentary while flipping channels. The opening shot was of a vast expanse of ocean, but instead of open water, there were rows of massive underwater pens. Fish farming operations she'd never really pictured before. At first, the idea still sounded good in theory, contained environments, consistent supply, affordable prices. But the narrator's voice carried a sobering undertone. She watched as the camera zoomed in on the crowded pens. Thousands of fish swam in tight circles, their scales brushing against each other in a constant shuffle. The narrator explained how such cramped conditions made it easy for parasites and diseases to spread, and how farmers had to add antibiotics and chemical treatments to keep the stock alive. Some of those chemicals, Nova learned, weren't allowed in certain countries, but were still used freely in others. Her stomach tightened as she listened to the part about feed. Farmed fish, especially in some overseas operations, weren't eating the natural diet they would find in the wild. Instead, they were fed pellets made from processed fish meal and oils, often containing contaminants like PCBs, industrial chemicals linked to immune system damage, and even cancer. The most unsettling part was the segment about artificial colorants. Without them, the salmon's flesh would be a dull gray. The bright pink that shoppers like Nova had always associated with freshness was, in many cases, an illusion. The next time she visited the market, she couldn't look at the farmed salmon fillets the same way. She imagined the crowded pens, the chemical baths, the manufactured color. It was as if the ice display carried not just fish, but the whole hidden story of where they'd come from. She realized that for years she had been buying with her eyes, choosing what looked appealing, without ever questioning what made it look that way. A few days later, she brought up the topic with Elise while they cooked together. "It's not that all farmed fish is bad," Nova said, slicing carrots for a salad. "But unless you know exactly where it's from and how it's raised, you can't really know what you're getting. And some places cut corners to keep costs down." Elise frowned. "So, wild-caught only?" Nova nodded. "At least for salmon. And if it's farmed, I'd want it from a country with strict standards." Her friend Margaret wasn't convinced at first. "Fish farming helps feed more people," she argued when Nova mentioned it over coffee. "Not everyone can afford wild-caught." Nova agreed, but gently added, "True, but some of those cheaper options come with hidden costs for your health. I'd rather eat less fish and know it's clean than have more and not know what's in it." The following weekend, Nova experimented in her kitchen. She'd found a recipe for baked wild salmon with lemon and herbs, paired with roasted vegetables. The flavors were clean and bright, and when Elise stopped by for lunch, she remarked on how fresh it tasted. "It's simple," Nova said with a smile, "but it's the kind of simple that makes you feel good afterward." That night, as she washed the dishes, she felt a sense of quiet empowerment. She couldn't control everything about her environment or her health, but she could control this. Choosing safer fish meant she was choosing a little more peace of mind. And for her, at 67, peace of mind was one of the most valuable things she could give herself. It was a quiet Sunday morning when the craving hit. Catfish, fried golden and crisp, the way her husband used to make it. For Nova, catfish wasn't just food. It was the smell of her childhood kitchen, the sound of oil gently popping in the skillet, the comfort of gathering around the table with family on lazy afternoons. That memory alone was enough to make her reach for the phone and call the small grocery store down the road. "Do you have catfish today?" she asked. The man at the counter replied, "Yes, fresh, just in this morning, imported." The word hung in her mind like a small pause in a song. Imported. She thought of what Dr. Lin had told her about catfish from certain parts of Asia, how some were raised in unregulated ponds, the water murky, the feed uncertain, how farmers, desperate to keep their fish alive in such conditions, sometimes used antibiotics and chemicals that weren't allowed in the United States. The problem, he had said, is that those antibiotics can contribute to bacteria that your body can't fight as easily. And for someone with a slower immune system, even a small infection can turn serious. Still, the pull of comfort was strong. She drove to the store, telling herself she'd ask where it was from. At the counter, she spotted the pale fillets laid out on ice. "Where exactly is this catfish from?" she asked. The clerk checked the label. "Vietnam." Nova's chest tightened, not with fear, but with disappointment. She could almost taste the crispy edges, hear the crunch as she bit into it. But she also pictured herself a week later feeling weak or unwell because of a choice she could have avoided. Instead of buying it, she went home and pulled out her recipe book. She remembered Dr. Lin saying that U.S. farmed catfish was generally safer, with better water quality and stricter regulations. She decided to try something different, pan-searing a fillet of U.S. farmed trout she had in the freezer, seasoning it just as she would have seasoned the catfish. The result surprised her. It had the same peppery crust, the same satisfying bite, and as she sat down at the table, she felt both comfort and relief. Later that week, she told Margaret about her decision. "It's funny," Nova said. "Sometimes the food we think of as safe because it's tied to a memory isn't safe anymore, not in the way we remember it." Margaret nodded slowly. "It's like the world changed while we weren't looking." Nova smiled faintly. "Maybe it's just that we're looking more closely now." That evening, Nova pulled out her old photo album. She stopped at a picture of her and her husband standing by the stove, smiling, a platter of fried catfish between them. The memory still warmed her, but now it came with a new layer: awareness. She realized that honoring the memory didn't mean she had to eat exactly the same thing. She could keep the flavors, the ritual, even the laughter, without carrying the hidden risks along with them. From then on, whenever she craved catfish, she made sure it came from a trusted U.S. source, or she found another fish that could carry the same seasoning and joy. Comfort, she decided, should never come at the cost of health. And once she understood that, she found she didn't miss the old way nearly as much as she thought she would. The rain was steady that Thursday morning, tapping against Nova's kitchen window as she sat with her second cup of tea. She had been reading an article Elise had sent her, something about food safety in imported seafood. The headline alone made her pause. What's hiding in imported catfish? The article went on to describe fish farms in parts of Southeast Asia, their ponds lined with plastic tarps, the water often cloudy and still. Some farmers, it said, used untreated river water, which carried industrial runoff from nearby factories. Nova read about how diseases spread quickly in these overcrowded ponds, forcing farmers to use antibiotics liberally. And not just the kind she'd heard of from her doctor, some were banned in the US because they could contribute to drug-resistant bacteria. She imagined these microscopic hitchhikers traveling across the ocean, tucked invisibly into fillets that would eventually be laid out on neat piles of ice in her local store. The thought made her stomach turn. She remembered something Dr. Lin had said during one of her appointments. With a younger immune system, a mild infection might mean a day or two of discomfort, but at your age, Nova, it could mean a hospital visit, or worse. She thought of the dizzy spell she'd had at the fundraiser months ago and how fragile those moments made her feel. The idea of adding another layer of risk, one she could completely avoid, no longer made sense. That afternoon, Margaret dropped by for a visit. Over tea, Nova brought up the article. Margaret frowned. "But the catfish at our market always look so fresh," Nova nodded. "I know. That's what makes it tricky. Fresh looking doesn't mean clean, and when it comes from far away, we can't see how it was raised or what went into it." She told Margaret about the antibiotic use, the murky water, the risk of bacteria the body might not be able to fight. Margaret shook her head slowly. "I never thought about any of that. I'll have to check labels from now on." Later, Nova went through her freezer, making sure none of the fish was from unknown or untrustworthy sources. She had started to see this habit not as paranoia, but as a form of self-respect. Reading the fine print on a package, asking a clerk where something was from, it was her way of saying, "I value my health enough to pause and ask." The following weekend, Elise invited her for dinner. "I'm making catfish," Elise said over the phone. Nova's heart skipped a beat, but before she could reply, Elise added, "Don't worry, it's from a farm in Mississippi. I checked." When Nova arrived and saw the crispy golden fillets on the table, she felt a wave of relief. It wasn't just about the food, it was about knowing her daughter was learning alongside her. That night as they ate, Nova realized something important. Avoiding dangerous fish wasn't about living in fear, it was about creating an environment where joy and safety could exist together. Whether it was a simple Tuesday lunch or a special Sunday dinner, she wanted every meal to be something she could enjoy without wondering what invisible baggage it carried. And if that meant turning away from imports raised in questionable conditions, then so be it. Her health, and the years she still wanted to fill, were worth far more than the fleeting satisfaction of a bargain fillet. The first real chill of autumn had crept into the air when Nova realized just how much her habits had changed. Standing in her kitchen, she was unpacking groceries, wild-caught salmon, a few tins of light tuna, fresh trout from a trusted local source, and a bag of leafy greens. Months ago, her cart would have looked very different. King mackerel from the sale bin, farmed salmon without a second glance at the label, maybe a pack of frozen catch of the day with no idea what species it was. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, the kind people post about online with before and after pictures. No, her change had been slow, almost quiet. One question at the seafood counter, one label checked, one choice swapped for another. And yet, as she slid the salmon into the fridge and lined the tuna neatly in the pantry, she realized how those small decisions had been adding up, not just in her meals, but in her body. She noticed it most in the mornings. Her mind felt clearer, like fog lifting earlier in the day. Her walks were steadier, her energy more consistent. There were still little lapses now and then. She was 67 after all, but they didn't carry the same weight of worry they once had. She had stopped waiting for her body to fail her and had started giving it the tools to keep working well. One evening, Elise joined her for dinner. They cooked together, moving easily around each other in the kitchen, Elise chopping vegetables while Nova seasoned a fillet of trout. "You've really changed how you shop," Elise remarked, glancing at the tidy fridge. "I guess I have," Nova said with a smile. "It's not about giving things up. It's about choosing the versions that give me more back." Over the meal, they talked about the months behind them, the dinners where she'd said no to swordfish, the sushi nights where she'd skipped the bigeye tuna, the Sunday afternoons where she'd chosen wild salmon over the cheaper farmed kind. "It's funny," Nova mused, "how you don't notice the difference day to day. But then one morning you wake up and realize you feel, well, good." Elise reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "That's the whole point, isn't it? To feel good for as long as we can." The next day, Nova bumped into Margaret at the market. Margaret proudly told her she'd started buying U.S. farmed catfish and had even convinced her sister to check the labels on her fish. They laughed about how they were becoming the seafood detectives of their group. But underneath the humor was something real, a shared awareness that these small, consistent swaps could shape the quality of their years ahead. That evening, Nova sat in her favorite armchair with a cup of chamomile tea. Outside, the leaves rattled softly in the wind. She thought about the long path from that first dizzy spell at the fundraiser to this moment, her fridge and pantry now filled with choices she trusted. None of it had been complicated. No crash diets, no rigid rules, just attention, curiosity, and a willingness to change. She knew she couldn't control everything about aging. There would be days when her knees ached or her memory faltered, no matter how carefully she ate. But she also knew that each safer choice was like adding another strong thread to the fabric of her health, threads that might hold her steady when the years pressed harder against her. And in that quiet kitchen, she made herself a promise. She would keep asking questions, she would keep reading labels, she would keep choosing the fish and the foods that gave her the best chance at clear mornings, steady steps, and long, laughter-filled dinners with the people she loved. Small swaps, yes. But over time, she believed, they could carry her years into the future with her mind sharp, her body strong, and her heart still wide open. Nova's journey began on an ordinary evening in the comfort of her own kitchen, cooking a meal she'd made 100 times before. She didn't know then that the dizziness, the memory lapses, and the fatigue creeping into her days might be tied to the very fish she believed was keeping her healthy. From that moment, one conversation with Dr. Lin opened a door she couldn't close, revealing mercury traps in king mackerel and tilefish, the hidden dangers of swordfish and bigeye tuna, the chemical load in farmed salmon, and the silent risks in imported catfish. At first, the changes felt small, choosing cod instead of tilefish at a restaurant, saying no to swordfish even on a special occasion, swapping raw tuna for cooked salmon, learning to look past the pink flesh of farmed salmon and see the story behind it, asking the quiet but powerful question at the market, where is this from? But over time, those choices added up. Nova's mornings grew clearer, her balance steadier, her confidence stronger. What began as a response to worry became a daily act of respect for her body, for her memories, and for the years she still wanted to live fully. And perhaps the greatest change wasn't just in Nova, but in the people around her. Elise, Margaret, and even strangers at the market who began making safer choices because she shared her story. To every senior watching this, your health is not out of your hands. Every meal is a chance to protect your mind, your strength, your independence. You don't have to overhaul your life overnight. Start with one swap, one question, one mindful choice. Because the truth is, small steps taken with care can carry you years forward, stronger, sharper, and ready for every moment still to come. Choose today so you can cherish tomorrow.